In 1975, in the Château d'Ambouillet, France, the leaders of 6 major industrialized nations gathered together, grappling with the aftermath of the oil crisis 1973 that had sent shockwaves through the global economy. This meeting gave birth to the G7, an alliance that became synonymous with the traditional centers of global economic and political powers. On the other side of the spectrum, the new millennium heralded the emergence of the BRICS in 2009, when the world was grappling with another crisis, the Great Recession.
So far, whenever there was recession in the world, it was brought about by the USA economy, and it was the USA which pulled the world out of the recession. But this time, which country is bringing the world out of recession? China.
A crisis born in the sophisticated financial markets of the West had spread its tendrils across the globe, reaching even the most robust emerging economies. In response, the leaders of 5 nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, gathered in Yekaterinburg, Russia, and formed the BRICS.
Now, staying with overseas events, the first ever BRICS summit is getting underway in Russia. The U.S. dollar's status as a reserve currency is sure to be one hot item under debate, but stealing the headlines right now, the arrival of Iran's President Ahmadinejad.
This alliance was not simply a reaction to immediate economic woes. It was a bold statement of intent. This video will delve into arguments, unveil complexities, disparities, and shared aspirations of both of these powerful groups on the world stage. Comprising of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS group has surged as a formidable force, surpassing the G7's global GDP contribution and accounting for nearly 1/3 of worldwide economic activity. With the proposal for a new BRICS currency gaining momentum, the 2023 summit promises to be a defining moment in their pursuit of a new world order, yet internal disagreements, geopolitical tensions, and uncertainties surrounding Putin's attendance cast shadows over BRICS unity and cooperation. In the book, BRICS, an anti-capitalist critique, by Patrick Bond and Anna Garcia, the authors justly explores the complex interplay between the BRICS nations and traditional Western powers.
I think American domination is quite honestly is finishing. The general trend towards definitely is away from Washington and towards Beijing, towards Brasilia, towards Delhi.
The author notes that the BRICS countries demand influence in global institutions, evidenced by their funding of the IMF, creation of new financial arrangements like the New Development Bank, and leading roles within the World Trade Organization. Ana Garcia further states that BRICS have exhibited inter-imperial stances, such as resisting intellectual property controls, supporting Russia in the Crimea conflict, and seeking to reduce dependence on the US dollar. The data from Countercurrents indicates that the BRICS nations have surpassed the G7 countries in terms of gross domestic product, GDP, calculated on purchasing power parity, PPP. This highlights the rising economic power of the BRICS nations and underscores their growing impact on the global economy and international relations. As of 2022, the BRICS combined GDP was $26.03 trillion, while the G7's combined GDP was $25.74 trillion. The BRICS share of global GDP was 31.59% in 2022, while the G7's share was 30.39%. China is the largest economy in the BRICS bloc, with a GDP of $19.99 trillion in 2022. India is the second largest economy in the BRICS bloc, with a GDP of $10.54 trillion in 2022. Brazil is the third largest economy in the BRICS bloc, with a GDP of $8.77 trillion in 2022. Russia is the fourth largest economy in the BRICS bloc, with a GDP of $6.24 trillion in 2022. South Africa is the fifth largest economy in the BRICS bloc, with a GDP of $3.5 trillion in 2022. The G7 countries comprises of advanced economies the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan still outshine the BRICS nations in terms of combined GDP, both in nominal and PPP adjusted terms. The G7 nations' stronger economic position is attributed to their established economic power and mature markets, which contribute to their overall economic strength.
G7 was in decline, eclipsed by the emergence of the G20. Well, the G20 has declined in relevance given the participation of Russia and China in that forum. And the G7 has once again emerged as the venue for the major economies of the world to coordinate policy on the critical issues of the day.
The United States has the world's largest economy and is a major center for manufacturing, technology, and finance. Germany is a leading exporter of machinery, vehicles, and chemicals. Japan has a highly developed manufacturing sector and is a major producer of automobiles, electronics, and steel. France has a strong industrial base in the aerospace, automotive, and energy sectors. Likewise, Italy is a major producer of luxury goods, textiles, and machinery. The BRICS countries have consistently exhibited higher economic growth rates compared to the slower-growing G7 economies. This is evident in the average GDP growth rate comparison for 2022, where the average BRICS countries recorded an impressive 4.5% growth rate, outperforming the average G7 countries' growth rate of 3.2%. This trend suggests that the BRICS nations hold the potential for sustained economic expansion in the future.
I believe the enlargement of the BRICS will be beneficial to the BRICS countries, beneficial to developing countries, and to increase the representation influence of this mechanism, and also to garner bigger power of the BRICS to serve the interests of developing countries.
While the BRICS nations exhibit a higher per capita GDP in comparison to the G7 countries, it is crucial to note that the G7 citizens on average enjoy significantly higher incomes. The per capita GDP for the G7 countries stands at $63,000, whereas the BRICS countries' per capita GDP is $17,000. This income disparity is primarily due to the G7's more even distribution of wealth. The G7 nations boast advanced industrial bases, efficient transportation networks, and robust trade relations with developed nations. In contrast, the BRICS countries rely more heavily on exports and may face greater vulnerability to global economic fluctuations. The G7's more established industrialization and infrastructure contribute to its economic dominance. For instance, the G7 countries account for 60% of the world's manufacturing output, while the BRICS countries account for only 20%. The G7 countries account for 70% of the world's trade, while the BRICS countries account for only 20%. Similarly, the G7 countries have a much higher density of roads, railways, and airports than the BRICS countries. Despite their economic challenges, the BRICS nations possess unique strengths, such as a youthful workforce, a large and growing population, and a focus on innovation. For example, the median age in the BRICS countries is 30 years old, while the median age in the G7 countries is 46 years old. This gives the BRICS countries a demographic advantage, as they have a larger pool of potential workers who are more likely to be productive and innovative. These factors position them favorably for continued economic growth and development in the future, potentially narrowing the economic gap with the G7. The G7 countries have historically held greater influence in shaping global policies and international institutions. They have significant shares in organizations like the IMF and World Bank, as well as permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council, privileges not shared by the BRICS nations. The G7 countries have a combined share of 40% in the IMF and 32% in the World Bank. This gives them a significant say in the decisions of these institutions, which play a major role in global economic governance. The G7 countries have permanent seats on the UN Security Council. This gives them veto power over any Security Council decisions, which means that they can block any action that they do not agree with. The G7 countries are also the largest donors to the UN. This gives them significant influence over the UN's agenda and priorities. The BRICS countries face conflicting interests and rivalries, which limit their ability to present a united front on various issues. Border disputes between China and India and competition for influence between Russia and China in Central Asia are examples of such challenges. China and India have a long history of border disputes, and these disputes have led to several military clashes in recent years. This has made it difficult for China and India to cooperate on other issues, such as trade and security. Likewise, Russia and China are both vying for influence in Central Asia, a region with important strategic and economic interests. Similarly, the war in Ukraine has divided the BRICS countries. China and India have refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, while Brazil and South Africa have condemned the invasion. This division has made it difficult for the BRICS countries to present a united front on the war in Ukraine. These geopolitical complexities hinder BRICS' collective impact on the global stage. The G7 countries have historically played a pioneering role in coordinating responses to global financial crises, employing their collective economic might to stabilize markets and assist struggling economies. The G7 countries played a leading role in the response to the 2008 financial crisis. They provided billions of dollars in bailouts to the financial sector. In 2020, the G7 countries pledged $1.1 trillion to help developing countries respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The G7 countries are also the largest donors to the UN's development programs. In 2021, they provided $79 billion in development assistance, which accounted for 70% of all development assistance worldwide. The G7 countries outpaced the BRICS countries in research and development, R&D expenditure, patents, and intellectual property, as well as technology adoption. In 2022, the G7 countries spent an average of 2.8% of their GDP on R&D, while the BRICS countries spent an average of 1.9% of their GDP. The G7 countries filed 3.5 million patents, while the BRICS countries filed 1.7 million patents. The G7 countries held 60% of the world's patent applications, while the BRICS countries held 10% of the world's patent applications. Similarly, the G7 countries had a higher rate of technology adoption than the BRICS countries in a number of areas, including 5G, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing. The BRICS nations are also actively investing in research and development, R&D, and are expanding their markets. This suggests a potential for increased competitiveness in sectors like information technology and telecommunications, paving the way for future growth. China, for instance, is investing in areas of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and 5G. In 2022, China spent an estimated $470 billion on R&D, which was more than any other country in the world. India spent an estimated $76 billion on R&D with a focus on software development, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy. Brazil spent an estimated $20 billion in agriculture, energy, and space exploration. Russia spent an estimated $45 billion in defense, aerospace, and nuclear power. South Africa spent an estimated $10 billion in health, mining, and telecommunications. The G7 countries have shown greater swiftness in adopting renewable energy sources. In 2022, renewable energy accounted for 26% of the G7 countries' total energy consumption. This was up from 20% in 2020 and 15% in 2010. The United States has set a target of 100% clean energy by 2050, and the European Union has set a target of 40% renewable energy by 2030. Similarly, the United States invested $32.9 billion in renewable energy in 2022. The European Union invested $114.7 billion in renewable energy in 2022. While the G7 countries have historically been major contributors to global carbon emissions, the BRICS nations' emissions have been rising rapidly. The G7 countries emitted 44% of global carbon dioxide emissions in 2022. This is down from 50% in 2010. The BRICS countries emitted 27% of global carbon dioxide emissions in 2022. This is up from 18% in 2010. The BRICS countries' emissions have been rising rapidly in recent years. In conclusion, the BRICS and G7 countries differ significantly in terms of economic, political, technological, and environmental factors, as well as their influence on global affairs. While the BRICS nations show promising strengths, such as their higher economic growth rates, youthful population, and the potential for future development, the G7 countries continue to hold dominant positions in various aspects due to their established economic powerhouses, political influence, and advanced technological prowess. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth coverage of more countries. Stay informed, and we'll see you in our next video.